I'm having conversations still with people in my field who are either district attorneys or they're investigators working major crimes or working homicides, who were having these kinds of conversations. And they're still bantering back with me. They're still doing what I would have done, right?
Mhm.
But in the end, they realize that their arguments really aren't working anymore. Their kind of clever catchphrase, kind of meme quality objections aren't really working. But it's still, they haven't, at this point, they still are satisfied that they're in this banter. But then occasionally I'll see somebody who I can tell something's happening in that guy's life, and all these objections are seeming more and more fragile to him.
Yeah, it's funny. Greg Kokel and I were just talking about how there's almost an irony because one of the things you talk about in Cold Case Christianity, you answer the question: were the gospel writers biased? And you're the same people who will say, well, we can't trust what they say because they're biased, are the same people who have an anti-supernatural bias when they read the New Testament, and then so they don't want to accept it. And one of the things we said was the question isn't do they have a bias? The question is do they have a bias that would cause them to distort the evidence for some personal reasons.
That's right. Yes. And bias always comes down to motive. So they always, listen, the reason why people have I had this for years, the reason why people have there's only 3 motives behind any bad behavior, including murders. And I learned this working murders, but it applies to any lesser crime. It's financial greed, sexual lust, pursuit of power. And I will tell you that there are reasons in those 3 categories that you might want to reject the existence of an all-powerful moral being that makes judgments about behavior. Now, I don't want to say that the reason why some people just have, I don't think I had the kind of life I was living before I became a Christian was pretty much like the life I'm living now. I mean, I was in a long-term relationship, faithful relationship with my wife. I was working as a police detective, and I think I still had all the same high standards. I knew right from wrong, and I wanted to. And I also signed on to a job where I knew I wasn't going to get rich. So I tried to protect myself from the 3 things that typically lead people to do stupid, right? Which are always sex, money, and power. So the question is, what would be motivating someone to cause this bias to begin with? And I think for a lot of us, not necessarily all of us, but a lot of us who reject the existence of God, those are factors we have to be honest about. If it was easy for me to I always say it this way, to throw the dart on the wall and just draw the bullseye around wherever the dart lands, because I was always my own standard of whether or not I was behaving well financially, sexually, and from a power perspective. A lot of times, just the simple idea that I was very comfortable from a power perspective being my own God. And that was really driving me to reject the existence of anything that might have authority over me. If nothing else, I did not want there to be a being. It was a power issue for me. And that was what was, I think, driving a lot of my bias against Christianity in specific, at least, was that if that Christianity was true, I would have to admit who I really, because it makes claims not just about Jesus of Nazareth. Christianity makes claims about you and me and our need for a savior. And I wasn't ready to hear those yet. I can tell you that for sure. And so that's part of, I think, what drives it. We have to be careful that we don't, like you said, there's an irony in the fact that the people who would claim there's a bias behind the authors, everyone's got a bias. When we select jurors, we're looking and we're asking the questions. We know what your bias is. We'll try to get that out in the open. If you've had problems with the police department before, if you've had problems in the area that we're going to be trying in this case, if you've had an interest in that area for some reason, if your husband's employed like the defendant was employed, we try to get to all the potential biases. But then we'll ask the question, okay, great. Do you think you can set down whatever it is you think about guys like our defendant, whoever that happens to be, or about the kinds of crimes that we're talking about in this case, and just be fair in your assessment of the evidence in this case? Because we know everyone's got a slant. Everyone's got presuppositions. We're simply asking people to suspend those, to know that's how I'm wired and I have a tendency to think that way. So can I, for the sake of this case, reorient my thinking to be fair? That's kind of what we're looking for in jurors. And not everyone can do it. And that's a lot of times why jurors get hung on cases, because not everyone can can do that, can suspend their presuppositions.
Mhm. Yeah, it's funny you say that. One thing I talk about sometimes is that, if you don't recognize that you have a bias, the bias can actually corrupt you because you don't realize it. The best thing you can do is realize you have a bias, admit what it is, and then
Right.
see if you can best put it aside and try to evaluate something objectively. Um,
No, I got friends in this industry, right, who are all Christian apologists, and they were Christians a lot longer than me, and they were Christians earlier than I was. They got to be Christians in their teens or in their 20s. And I had a lot of years to be the kind of skeptical jerk that I became, especially when dealing with people who are always lying to you. And whenever they'll ask my advice, they know they're going to get the worst possible case scenario from me, because that's what I do for a living, right? You assume the worst in people until you investigate that, and okay, now I finally trust you. But I don't start off trusting. I start off doubting. I start off saying, no, that guy's a liar. That's probably not true. Have you ever watched House, the old TV show where the Dr. House, he assumes that everyone who comes in to be diagnosed is lying for one reason or another, and that's kind of the assumption of the show. Well, that's really where I stand too. And so they know that that's my bias. They know that I'm a skeptic, and I'm assuming the worst in people, and they'll tease me about it. And I also know I have that inclination. So I have to work. Like all of us know where our rough edges are. And we have to work, right, to kind of smooth over our rough edges. That's kind of what it comes down to presuppositions. If you know you have this inclination to go in that direction, then you know you have to constantly fight that, right? Because you're always seeing the worst in people. You're going to have to fight that to not be a jerk all the time. So a lot of that is just trying to identify where the presuppositional bias is, and then work hard to try to suspend it.
yeah, yeah, and you just talked about kind of your maybe moral rejections or emotional rejections of Christianity before.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess kind of a personal question, because you talked about how you would easily poke holes. You had Christian friends who couldn't really defend their faith that well. What do you think if that young version of you had met the version of you now who could have answered those questions the way that you do?
Well, okay, so here I am. I'm an evidential apologist, but I do recognize that God has to do something in the heart of people before any of this. I'm not the kind of person who says the evidence will convince you. You don't even need the power of God. The evidence is so good, you'll be convinced. No, I think what happens is that God removed the enmity that I had toward him first, and then the means by which the truth of the gospel was communicated to me because of who I am, it needed to be evidential. You could have preached the gospel to me, and I would have still had barriers of belief. But because who I am, I took this path, but I would never have been willing to take that path. There's no way I would have bought a Bible. Something had to happen to get me that interested to even go so far as to buy the Bible to look at it. I don't think that's coincidence or my own, intellectual power. I think what that is these are the things that God has to do. And so I recognize that. And if you had come to me, and I say this all the time, in the end, it would have been nice at least if people had removed my lame excuses. Because what I was really holding were a series of lame excuses. And because nobody could ever, knock those down for me, I built those up into idols. I could use those. It's kind of like if you're a boxer and you learn certain punches that work for you, and you got a really good jab, and so you just jab the dog snot out of your opponent until finally, because that's what you can do. And so that's kind of what I started to do intellectually. I had these things I could say to stop the conversation. If I just say this, he's not going to stop talking to me. I'm going to shake him. And so I was willing to do that because I felt like really of all the people who should be more reasonable, it should be you, Mr. Detective, my partner. Can I trust you on this case if I can't trust you on that stuff? Really, you hold to this stuff and you don't even know why it's true. And you just think, well, I've had an experience. Oh, good for you. Everyone's had an experience. Okay. So that's what you're going to offer me is your experience, how you became a Christian. Well, let me offer you how I didn't. Okay. And if all we're doing is having a battle of experiences, I win. Okay. That's what I would have said. So I needed something a little more because of the kind of jerk I was. And so I think that that kind of thing somebody was praying me into that position where I would probably, where I would let down my guard and stop being a jerk long enough to see, is this actually good evidence? Now, I don't think what God does is he makes an unreasonable truth seem reasonable to us under his power. I think this is reasonable from the get-go, but we have unreasonable biases that keep us from being fair. And that once that has been leveled, once God has removed the tilt, and so we are fair. Oh man, this is obvious, right? How did I not see it before? How did I not look at this earlier? That's kind of the feeling you have, right? It's like an eye-opening experience. But I think that's just that. So that's where I fall on that issue. I think if you would have presented this with me earlier, I probably would have still been the jerk, but I would have known that my defenses were stripped. And by the way, you probably still having conversations. I'm having conversations still with people in my field who are either district attorneys or they're investigators working major crimes or working homicides, who were having these kinds of conversations, and they're still bantering back with me. They're still doing what I would have done, right? Mm-hmm. But in the end, they realize that their arguments really aren't working anymore. Their kind of clever catchphrase, kind of meme quality objections aren't really working. But it's still, they haven't, at this point, they still are satisfied that they're in this banter. But then occasionally I'll see somebody who I can tell something's happening in that guy's life, and all these objections are seeming more and more fragile to him. And now I'm able to work a little bit, and it's not my clever arguments that are doing this. But I do think that this is always the way. If you look at the book of Acts, you will see that the form of evangelism taken by the disciples to convert the empire is a form of evangelism in which evidence is at the center. Now, I've got a good friend, right? I call him a friend, Ray Comfort, who I write a lot at his website on evangelism. But I will tell you that form of evangelism, which I think is powerful, show me my need first, show me who I really am, and then offer the solution. Pretty much a lot of 21st century, 20th century evangelism is based on that. Let me show you your need and then offer you the solution. But that is not what you're going to see in the book of Acts. You're going to see that Paul repeatedly, all these guys repeatedly made a case for the Messiah based on the Old Testament, and then said, and we saw all of it come to fruition in Jesus of Nazareth. Show that the Messiah must suffer, die, and rise again in the Old Testament, and then claim as direct evidence that we saw it. We saw him do all those things, then die and rise again. That is consistently how the message of Christianity is given in the first century, and that's really the approach I took. But I don't think a lot of us are ready to do that. By the way, you'd have to know something about Christianity in order to take that approach. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's important for us to know what the evidence really is.